My name is Renata Meyer. I'm going to be moderating today's panel. I'm a member of Golden Seeds, which is an angel investor network. We are about 300 members strong. We're about 300 members strong, of which 100 are involved in the life sciences. And members like myself are very interested in bringing in life sciences companies and improving deal flow. So Golden Seeds basically invests in women founder or CEO companies with a valuation of under $5 million, and we typically invest about a quarter to $2 million in the initial round. So today's panelists offer breadth and depth of experience, and we're very fortunate to have them with us, including a couple of serial entrepreneurs. And today we're going to focus on the fundraising process of early life science companies. We're going to start with the founding and initial funding challenges, and then we're going to walk through some of the hurdles and inflection points that you can expect to encounter along the way, all, of course, while focusing on the end game, on the impact of subsequent funding rounds. At this point, I'll have the panelists introduce themselves. Tyler, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tyler Wonke. I'm co-founder and CEO of InnoBladev. We're an early stage medical technology medical device company that's funded at Northwestern University. So we're based out of Chicago and also have an office in Boston. And we're working on advanced energy devices for ablation of residual cancer left during surgery. So mostly looking at breast cancer, but also liver cancer and a few other cancers.
Yeah, my name is Jim Iverson. I'm CEO of SemJam Pharmaceutical. We're a therapeutics company here in New York. Our focus is in the pain space. We are repurposing small molecules using the 505(b)(2) pathway.
Ilan Legas, founder and CEO of Oven Orthopedic Technologies based in Connecticut. This is my fourth startup. 3 startups before that with Exits, and prior to that Johnson & Johnson. Woven deals with the aging population and compromised bones and improves fixation for faster and better healing.
Jim Biggins, founder and CEO of Access Vascular. We've developed a novel material that prevents the thrombosis response. We're focused our efforts on developing new products in the venous access space as a first entry into the market. We received FDA clearance earlier this year on our first product, which is a PICC line. So essentially, we've developed a load-bearing hydrogel material that prevents the foreign body response, and in this case, reducing or eliminating thrombus as a source of complications for venous access. Lots of other, it's a platform technology, so many other opportunities for us to develop products, but focus primarily on venous access for now.
Okay, great. So a wide variety of experience, and our panelists are going to share their stories. So to begin, why don't we talk about the very earliest stages, what's important when you're just starting out. Basically, what does it take to get started? Should we start?
I mean, I can start actually, if I may. So for us, getting started really early, we didn't, first of all, I was a first-time CEO, so it was even more difficult than it is for some of these successful serial CEOs. So it was tough to just get right off the bat, to have investors come in and join, our sort of capital efforts. So one of the ways that we got started is by getting traction and awareness by doing other non-dilutive mechanisms. So we got started with an academic grant, if you will, to get going, as I'm sure a lot of you have or have heard about. That was a good way to get capital into the business, so we could start developing the technology, without getting diluted, but also just get the capital in the business before it was really an investable business, or at least what people thought it was. So we did some non-dilutive funding to get started. We actually did some business plan competitions and some sort of a-traditional stuff that ended up bringing in a couple $100,000 into the business. And so that's how we were able to really get off and running, start the company, starting to pay lawyers and all the other things that you need above and beyond what just our academic grant funding would cover. And then by that point in time, we had enough traction to actually go to investors. And we didn't have a VC or a big investor like that was ready to invest. But we did start to have angel investors who are interested. So we started off nice and easy by switching from sort of this non-dilutive funding mechanisms to bring in investors under a convertible note structure. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but we opened up a convertible note about, let's just say $1 million to get started, and we would take on investors one by one with check sizes of at least $25,000, sometimes $50,000, $100,000 to get going. And by doing that and allowing that as sort of a rolling close, we were able to just continue investing and bring in more and more individual angel investors until we had a good size of capital. And eventually that note round became $1.5 million, sort of went from a couple hundred to $1 million to $1.5 million, and that was enough for us to do all of our sort of advanced prototyping and early animal studies to convince the later stage investors to come in, and then we started getting big investors coming in and writing 7+ figure checks. So that's how we got started.
Great use of non-dilutive funding. Jim?
Yeah, for us, we entered this, and I'm going to take a little bit different approach. We've been self-funded to date, but from starting out early, the first thing that was important to us was making sure that we've identified a large unmet need that need to be solved. And then based on our therapeutic solution for that is to validate the science. And all of this stuff goes into ultimately building the plan. And then building the team, making sure that we've got the right team on board. And that team consists of not only the people who are doing the work and the clinical side and the product development side, but also advisors and scientific advisors. And then in validating that, looking at ultimately, building your financing, building out the financing model, and what we're doing, our model is around licensing. So we have 7 assets under development, and our goal is to sell or license each of our assets by 2023. So we're doing the front end work. We're going to raise capital in the parent company. We've set up seven subsidiaries, fully owned subsidiaries. And we've entered a license agreement just recently on one of the assets, but our goal is to just work through all 7 for a sale or license.
In the case of woven orthopedic technology, we used the state of Connecticut as non-dilutive, so we got a grant and a loan that started us. And then very much like Tyler said, a convertible note to take us to the next stage. But all that convertible note obviously rolled into our Series A. But that's definitely the way to start. What I'll speak more about than the type of the investors is maybe the importance of having a data room ready and having everything that you could imagine an investor will want. If it's a state, if it's an angel, you have to have all the ducks in the row. The questions of where the use of the proceeds will be used, what will the next stage look like, how much capital will you need in the lifetime of the company, what do you think in comps of an exit will look like and why, you have to explain it, how did you get to the pre-valuation that you got in that Series A. All those things, obviously at this point, a medical device or a healthcare or life science doesn't have data, but you have to sell the promise. And the promise has to be backed up by a lot of information and a lot of comps. And that's what we did, have a data room, gave access, and that was a very important building block to believe that promise. Obviously, you asked about early stage, we could speak later about how Series B, etc. look, but selling that promise and being very organized on the details, I think is very important.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating panel to see the cross-section of experiences. I would say my experience is very similar to Tyler's, with the exception of we didn't get non-dilutive financing. I was able to work with a product development firm that I know of in the Boston area. They leased us out a little space. We were able to build kind of the first part of our preclinical data on very short money. We used that to look for, I would say, investors that were investing in the team much more so than any of the data that went along the market size. All that stuff didn't matter. It was all about the team. So we got about $250,000 from 2 investors that were investing just because I had met them and they liked the story. They continue to invest, I found out later, primarily because one of the investors' fathers passed away because of a catheter-acquired infection. And so that was really what led to that first investment in his continued support and investment in the company. And so very interesting to see the cross-section of how these things come about. Everyone has a different story, and it all comes together in some way, shape, or form that you never anticipate. And I would say we just continue to build out from there. We get some additional data. We keep the round open. There's always rolling closes. We continue to do rolling closes. It's very difficult to get all of the cats herded at the same time in the same place. And so we just continue to sell the story, continue to build value for the shareholders and do what's right for the shareholders, and that's worked out for us so far.
Great. So would any of you like to speak a little more broadly about how to put together a list of potential investors, assuming you're starting from scratch, and basically trying to get to know the investor's mandate and to make sure whether that you're a good fit?
I can start again for this one. I guess our experience hasn't always been the best example of how to do it. It sometimes feels sloppy, and just recently we brought in our latest investor who came in under our current round, and it was like some warm connection from another investor that we already have, and we ended up closing $1.5 million in like 4 weeks, start to finish, from signing the NDA. So sometimes it happens quick and not organized. But the ways that we've done it that I feel are probably the most comfortable or tried and true to really make sure that you're going to be successful at raising a round are when we, at either this company or another company on the board of, have put together a nice list of all these target investors you want to reach out to and been methodical about going through the list and keeping the process moving forward. You mentioned herding cats. It is like herding cats, obviously, to bring in investors into your round. It's sort of like herding cats to find investors to even come around in the first place. I mean, they got you probably saw today, investors have their mind on some of their deal that they're working on and closing now, and they'll forget about you if you're not persistent. So back to the organization, we've used Life Science Nation platform and other avenues to sort of congregate all of our investors and target investors in a list, and sometimes we'll find, or you'll eventually find, that it's not a good fit for your current round. But that's no matter. We would just have a separate worksheet, a separate Excel worksheet for, okay, maybe they're for next round, for Series B or A or whatever. And then we'll keep a list, and when we really wanted to do the process right, we would sort of methodically go through the list, reach out to everybody until we would get in contact and move the ball forward, whether that was getting an NDA if that was relevant, getting them to review our initial deck, getting them to go to the second more detailed deck, to move to further conversations, to move to a term sheet. And this was important for our first real price round because we had two groups. Originally we had one group on the West Coast who we thought was going to be our only option for an investor to fund us. But we kept our list going. We kept meeting other groups despite knowing that we'd get a term sheet, or thought we'd get a term sheet from this group. And we ended up getting another group to come to the table with a term sheet. And actually, I remember we were so close with both of them. We just said, look, we need to do this deal. I want the term sheet, in my inbox by next Thursday. And they both did that. Both investors actually gave us a term sheet, and we were in a situation where we had two term sheets on the table at the same time. So, long story short, keeping sort of an organized list and outreach and keeping it moving and not giving up on investors is a good way to optimize your chances of, one, getting an investor, or if you're in a more favorable situation, getting two or even more investors to have term sheets on the table, which I think is the situation you're in right now.
Yes.
It's better to have more than
Yeah, we've used Life Science Nation database as well. We're just starting our round now, so we're looking at a broad spectrum of previous investors that I've had in other endeavors. We're building the list. We're reaching out to people and promoting what we're doing, and then also opening up the space for those who are interested or might know somebody that's interested to kind of leverage the whole social media aspect of things. We're building our list. And one comment I do want to say on the data room too. I mean, we established our data room very, very early on, and because of how our structure is, and it's been a lot of early stage investors that we've signed CDAs with, and we've used Dropbox, and a link with a password protected link with a sunset on it has worked out very, very well for us.
It costs a lot of money.
Yeah,
To spend a lot of money on this.
And then we've been diligent in the organization of populating a data room. So any in vivo study we get back, or any new valuation, make sure we're keeping that data room as updated as possible. So as we're going out to investors, and we have several people who've given us an indication of interest, they don't want to be the lead investor. They've reviewed our data room, they've done some diligence on us, but we can turn them on quickly when we get that lead investor in.
Definitely. It should be a live document, but it should start before the process. Because once you have an interesting company or VC or whoever they are, you don't want to start populating. Believe me, it's a process that takes 4 to 6 weeks, depends what you have, but you have to put all the governance of the company, all your board records, all the sales models, the cap table. There's so much to put in there. So having a live document from day number one, the data room, we also use Dropbox. We tried something fancy, cost us a fortune, realized that's not the way to go, and went back to a Dropbox. But preparing all that is very, very essential. Speaking a little more about the process and who to go, I think it's very important to identify what stage you are, what is the capital needs that you need, where will it take to you, how is the funding going to be used. And then we also have a huge database that we have it by region, by type of investor. So is it a VC, is it a private equity, family office, high net worth individual. We even have sovereign fund groups, which is again not spoken about here, but it's a huge group of sovereign funds today in the Gulf area, even in countries in Asia that have sovereign funds that I don't think a lot of medical device companies are tapped into, but a huge potential there. So we have that organized also by that category. And then buying groups. Hospitals today have buying groups. There's a great representation of them even in this conference, if it's Mount Sinai or Northwell, Columbia. So those buying groups are a different category, and obviously by region. So if you're traveling anyhow from to Boston for a conference, you already have all the companies or all the subjects in Boston that you could contact. So you're not traveling for a day for one meeting, now you start leveraging that effort. Same thing if I'm going from the East Coast to California. So we have that database by region. Now what's very important, and again takes a lot of discipline, and that I don't always have, I'll admit that, is to write meeting minutes. When is the last time you met this person? What was his comments? If he said no, why did he say no? What does he want to see for next stage? Did you communicate with him by phone, by email, face-to-face? And then, again, as it said here, come back to him in a year. We recently got our regulatory approvals. I am now tracking all the people in Excel that said, tell me when to come back when we got a regulatory approval, and I'm contacting them now. So you really have to keep this, again, a live document. It seems like a lot of work, but it's well worth the effort. Someone that said no, showed you the door, you always could go back through the window. You really need to do that. And sometimes it takes to camp out with a tent, and this, again, be very active. I wouldn't say every day, but you definitely, people want to hear your story and see the consistency and see the advancements that you're doing over time.
Yeah, so for me, I think my process is continual. I think I probably spend about 90% of my time raising money, and that's cultivating relationships. I try to make about 10 calls every day to contacts that are either potential investors or can connect me with investors, some sort of connection, and try to speak with them live. Again, shoot for about 10 per day, and just continue to cultivate those relationships and create a list and a process. I'm not always good about keeping notes, but it has been a very important part of the process. A lot of times, as was just mentioned, potential investors might tell you, okay, come back to me when you have FDA clearance. you go back to them and then they tell you need sales. But that's just part of the process.
The target definitely moves all the time and not to the favorable direction. I'll just add one thing again, if anyone in this audience is raising money, it would be interesting to know who here is an entrepreneur and who's raising. But this a key message is that no is always yes with conditions. So many times you'll hear the no before you'll hear the yes, and it's again coming back at the right time.
And the sale doesn't start until they say no.
How's that?
So for the benefit of our panelists, how many of you are in fact entrepreneurs and raising money? Aha. So I guess I'm wondering whether any of you have ever considered hiring a third-party broker to raise money, and why or why not? Pros and cons of those. And you could start at the bottom, or you could grab it, either way.
I'm happy to go.
Okay.
I actually did hire one. They've been okay. They've made some introductions, but I think I was told by our council never to hire somebody because they usually don't produce, and so I'm less than satisfied. But I'm glad I went through the process to understand there's nobody that's going to sell the company better than you. It's just you just have to put the time in, and you have to commit to making the connection. And I believe at this point, doing it yourself is pretty much what I'm going to have to do. Just,
Cards in it.
yeah, exactly.
Anyone else?
Yeah, we've spoken to a number of investment banking houses, and it's similar story. You dig into who's going to do the book, who's going to do the roadshow. You find out that you're doing all the work anyway, and that's what's always led me to take a step back. And I do believe in investment bankers. I've used them with other transactions that I've done. But I'm weary, and I'm weary because it's time and money, and for us to advance our technology, they're the two things we're battling with all the time. And so it's another way is also when you think about what an investment banker might get from a retainer and also a piece of the deal in networking. If you find somebody that brings in somebody that's bringing in a favorable amount of capital, there's no reason why you can't incentivize somebody. So building that list, we're in the opioid, we're doing work in the opioid space right now, and there's a lot of activity around that opioid withdrawal, and so finding prospective investors, there's a lot of talk, and if we need to incentivize somebody to help us access capital, it's everybody accepts that.
I have the next question. In terms of finders, has anybody considered the challenges associated with non-licensed brokers and the gray market and the current SEC attitude toward that?
I would definitely, that would be my only comment. If you decide to take a broker, do a lot of due diligence, make sure that it's FINRA registered, you should send the registration, you should prove that in the US, do not work with anyone else, even if they have a very creative idea of combinations, because as a CEO or any executive, you're going to be liable. So in Europe, it's very much still a gray area. So if you have a European that his expertise is a family office, he doesn't have to have a license in the US. So you could have a separate rule, but I'm not a lawyer, I'm just quoting how I work.
So even if you're an American company, you
Yes.
take money from Europe?
From Europe, if
Using a
it's a
non-licensed
European
finder.
investors, not someone that has a social security or identification, a US identity. So it has to be overseas. So in our case, Series A, obviously, we didn't use a broker, something that was smaller and faster. Series B is a very big round that we want to get the cash positive, so more aggressive. And to get to those sovereign funds, you need the broker-dealer relationship in those regions of the Gulf. So that was something that was justified. I found someone that was a partner of Jeffries, so if Jeffries qualified him in the US, it's good for me. I did my qualification as well. So they did on me an onboarding process, I did on them an onboarding process, and it was legitimate. But they're not doing any fundraising in the States for US companies. So, yeah. So that's something that I would just be very careful.
So the SEC is really about protecting U.S. investors.
You and your investors, and no D&O insurance could cover that protection, so I really, those don't even get the gray areas, because I still get calls of, oh, let's roll you into a public company, I take XYZ, I say, are you a broker? No, I hang up. I don't want the creative way, because it's a lawyer and it's no way to improvise on it.
And just to maybe elaborate on that, even when we started the company up until this day, we have a lot of people that want to be advisors that are not FINRA registered, and there are a lot
The
of
consulting.
creative ways that they can help you raise money. But to your point, I think it's just best not to go down that path. It seems like the easier one. It seems like it would be helpful, but I think avoiding those relationships is probably smart.
Yeah, and considering the amount of money that you're looking to raise, I mean, there's from people early stage with looking at Kickstarter, and then some stuff now that you hear a lot of with Bitcoin, and there's a company, Start Engine, and then with the American Jobs Act, that you're able to raise $1.3 million or so with unaccredited investors. But then when you cross over that threshold, you got to go to accredited investors, and there's a whole bunch of, once you step into the accredited investor, there should be a broker-dealer involved. But if you're doing an early stage, and a friends and family or angel round, and you're under the $1 million, you may want to consider some of the other alternatives out there, but just make sure that there's a clear path from you going from an unaccredited investor to an accredited investor base.
What do you do with your private placement memorandum and a questionnaire that you have? So we have a questionnaire in the PPM, and under that we qualify, because we only take money from accredited investors. But that doesn't need to be a broker. So one comment that I could offer on broker-dealer, take one if it really fulfills your need, and it's not the traditional VCs or family offices that you could reach anyhow. But like I gave an example, for me it was a sovereign fund, and in another case it was someone that had expertise in debt, in the debt facilities. So I'm not familiar with that, I wasn't as familiar with that, and that's all he did as a broker. So in those two cases I used brokers in the past, which was a successful relationship, but traditionally this for VCs I wouldn't use a broker.
Just follow up on that question. Have you found that there's some of these smaller broker-dealers or brokers that are specialized in life sciences?
Yes, yes, definitely. They need to be specialized because they need to understand the ins and outs of what you're doing and be able to answer those questions.
Okay, we're going to turn this up to the topic of valuation, but I just have one more question first. Ilana, I'm curious about the sovereign funds, and particularly in the Gulf, and what their level of interest is in the life sciences inherently. Like, did you have to do a big sell job, or are they captivated by the idea of being part of the wave, the biotech wave?
I think they're more open because they have needs. So in our case, deficiency of vitamin D leads to poor quality bone, which is exactly what we're trying to answer. The unmet clinical need is compromised bone. So it's definitely that connection, but I think they understand that the oil and gas is nice. They also have to take care of the human aspect and the patients, and they want to have centers of excellence. They get a lot about tourism, medical tourism that developed in India more, in other regions, so they're getting the understanding of that. So there's a lot of the beginning, I would say, of entrepreneurship in those countries. And so our money that we got is also, we have to develop those regions as well.
Do you have a recommendation on how to make an inroad into those
We
wealth
have to
funds?
shoot it.
Okay.
Yeah, and cross all the cultural barriers, and there's just so many things to talk about. I think that's a panel discussion in itself. Yeah. All right, so pre-money valuation. How much dilution is appropriate at any given stage, and how do you make those assessments? If you can just add some color to all the factors that come into
Oh,
play.
no, this is a tricky one. I think I suggested we talk about this, but I didn't want to have to talk about it. I mean, valuation, valuation for always should be, it should be somehow market-based for how you get there in terms of your investors. For us, it's always been a discussion and negotiation with our investors. I mentioned earlier that we were fortunate or fortunate enough to get in a situation where we had multiple term sheets between two investors, one in the Midwest, one in the West Coast. And so we had, literally two term sheets on the table to compare. And we were able to negotiate back and forth to some extent with the investors over not just valuation, but other things. Valuation is obviously important just as the basic, because that's really what your company's worth before they put in the money, and then that number plus whatever they put in is your post-money valuation. But it's not just about valuation. You have to also think about the other terms on the table. I'll spend another second on valuation in a second, but my major point is it's not all about valuation. Another big part of your term sheet is going to be, well, what type of vehicle is it? If you're talking about common equity and they're coming in on the same terms that you have, which I've seen with our company and other companies, well, then the investors literally has the same class of equity that you are. There's no liquidation preference. That means that they get their money out earlier. That tends to be company favorable, and if you can negotiate that, that's always a positive that you should look at, as well as valuation, as opposed to like a participating preferred or any liquidation preference round, which is probably the most typical is to be. I would think the most typical is probably a 1x liquidation preference on your stock, which would be a separate class. So I think that there's other things to think about too. There's the preference. There's how much control they have. We've had investors come in with very favorable valuations and class of equity, common equity, but they have some pretty strict board requirements that are really important to them. Multiple seats on the board and even particularly strong voting rights. So long story short, you need to do all the math together before you choose a deal. It's not just who's going to give you the highest valuation or the best pre-money valuation for your company, but also the bigger picture, control, and how some of these other elements play into it. One last word I'll have on valuation is, I mentioned it should be market-based. It should be. You want sort of all else equal the highest valuation you could have, but you don't want a stupid valuation that's going to shoot yourself in the foot for later. You should think about your evaluation of your company almost like a market where there's a supply and a demand curve, if you remember learning that in economics. And there really is a supply and a demand of investors and companies. And so if you really take a crazy high valuation from some of the angels early on, it's going to limit your prospects and raising capital later. So it's always that balance of keeping a high enough valuation that you feel like you're really incentivized and going to have a great exit, but also keeping it low enough that your pool of potential eventual investors exists, and there'll be people that will go on to invest at a higher and higher valuation. Otherwise, you just put you and the existing investors or your former investors particularly at risk of a big down round, and nobody wants that. So it's always sort of a balance.
Yeah, the only thing else I can add to that was good, is it's subjective. So we trying to put off as long as possible to get to a point. Don't raise money too early, and then when you're raising money, as Taylor said, is that you don't want to. You want to raise enough to get you to a milestone that's going to allow you to raise your next round. And oftentimes I see people raise money too early, not enough money at too high a valuation, and that just causes lots and lots of complications because people don't want to back down from that. And I just think it's go the distance, stay as long as you can, and try to always be focusing on that next inflection point that you believe is going to give a step up in valuation.
Yeah, I think valuation is kind of almost overrated. As we heard, there's a lot of other elements, like what other preference, liquidation preference, voting rights, those could be important. Whatever your valuation is, know how to protect it, because obviously that question will come up. So show comps, show what you had, how did you get to that number, is it management, is it IP, is it data, potential exit, whatever you could bring to the table that has evidence, bring it, because you'll for sure be asked about it. But for instance, in our case, our largest investor said, I don't care what your pre-valuation is. If you succeed, we'll all succeed. If we don't, we'll all lose. So there was no discussion even on the valuation, and that was with our largest investor. But let's be prepared for that question, how did you get to that number? Because that will definitely come up.
I think the only other thing I can add is, every time we do a price round, my gut is to push for a higher valuation. But you do the math, and for the most part, you know, the numbers and what you're fighting for don't always equal, you know, what you want to get out of the company, right? So another 5 or 6 million on the valuation, depending on what you're raising, most of the time it's inconsequential, assuming that you have the right investor. So just echoing what everyone else said, make sure you have the right investor before you get all hung up on the valuation.
Great, thank you. So one last question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So board participation. What is the right amount at the right time to, and what are the right conditions to accept your investment in the board?
For us, it was $1 million in Series A and B together.
Yeah, I think we run on when we formed our formal board of directors for Delaware C Corp, we did so when the first investors stepped to the table. They did over $1 million single investment, and then they came on. And then I had 2 other sort of advisor, board member-like folks who were with the company, and they didn't put in $1 million or even $500,000 each, but they had put in a couple $100,000 each, and they were representing all of the other shareholders who all put, you know, $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 checks. And in fact, in our case, they happen to know a lot of those other early angel investors from their previous days at Baxter and the other big companies in our area. So it worked out fairly well for us to have, you know, our lead investor. They actually got 2 seats for the amount they put on and continue to put on. And then we had 2 other seats from earlier angel investors who didn't put as much money, but they were representing all the other investors who put on. So that's how we formed our board of 5, and we have the same board today.
Yeah, I have a similar situation when we started the company. There was a few key people that were providing guidance and also connections to capital. And it was one of the better things that I had done with the company is get these people on and invested not only capital-wise, but also their time and effort. And they were able to bring along a lot of additional capital. So for me, it was part of the fundraising effort was having people that had connections to additional capital. So, and we continue to update the board and bring in new advisors as the company grows, as we need more access to deep pockets.
Yeah, we currently have a board of advisors that some of them have offered when given the opportunity to join a board of directors, and the responsibility is much, much greater. The liability is much, much greater, and it's just another thing. We know that when we bring in investors, we know that we're going to need a board of directors. From previous experiences that I've had, you know, I've had usually five board members, and you know, coupled with that is, you know, as you're moving all your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, your D&O insurance, it's a necessary evil, you know, and because now you're having somebody who's protecting the shareholders.
Great, thank you all. So we can turn the discussion over to Q&A. Does anyone have any questions?
Alana, this is for you. You talked about the management team having comps. What do you mean by that? Like, how would you go to investors and say, look, this is my management team. This is what they deserve. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean?
When you do pre-valuation,
Yeah.
so I think with pre-valuation, it's many components. So obviously it's IP. The question again, in what series you are, do you already have IP that was granted, not only the patent applications? In our case, we already had it, because that's the first asset that we bought. But it's also the experience of the management team. Are the serial entrepreneurs, have they done it before? Who's your VP of R&D? Does he know how to take it from a concept into clinical, into commercialization? Really selling the people's experience, that's very important, I feel, in the investors, and you put on it some value. There's not really a formula out there, but I'm just suggesting that maybe you have that formula and that rating, and say HR, I'm rating like this, IT like this, other tangible or non-tangible assets, I'm rating like that. But you have to have something that you protect, because in our case, in every case, they ask, how did you get to your number?
Thanks.
And if I can expand on that a little bit from our perspective, we use the same thing. We use comps. Well, we do a bottoms-up, like to do a bottoms-up approach to explain our value from a bottoms-up. Why do we build up to be worth this much? But it also helps for the comps a lot when we're pitching, because you got to be aware of what companies like your company, are selling for in the marketplace. If it's got the potential to be a $500 million, $1 billion exit, that's a lot different than if your technology only has the potential to exit for, say, $50 to $100 million. It's just different for what your pre-money can be one way or the other. And so, like specifically, one way that we'll do it is we'll look at the comps, and in our market, in our place, there's been like 3 or 4 companies in the last 2 months that have just sold in breast oncology. So it's been helpful. Company X sold for $200 million and they got to this amount of revenue. Company Y sold for $125 million and they only got to this much revenue. So then it starts to tell a story about how companies are selling. And the reason it's helpful is because you can think about it and say, well, if we can sell for $200 million, if we can get it to $15 million in revenue, and this other company sold for $100 million, but they only got it to like $1 million or $2 million in revenue, then you can start thinking, well, now my valuation can be here, and I can take on this investor's $5 million and probably get it to $1 million in revenue, and then I could get sort of $100 million exit. Or if I really want to build into a $15 or $20 million business, then I could really get more of like a $200+ million exit, just using the comp, so it makes sense to have this valuation. You can kind of work backwards like that. And actually, the important piece of information that everyone needs to know to some extent, or at least acknowledge, if not live by it, is that the investor who's investing in you got to know what they want. And a lot of investors are looking at your deal with a lot of other deals, and they want to know that they can make some amount of money. Many times, a good rule of thumb, and a lot of investors I know think about it like, this is sort of a early stage deal, maybe you just got regulatory clearance or just about to, it's sort of that Series A, B deal. They might be looking to be able to make 5 times their money in the deal. Well, if you have a lot of comps in the marketplace, you can think about it and say, well, how can I make them 5 times? Well, if it's only a $100 million exit, or if it's a $100 million exit, then the valuation would have to be post-money, would have to be $20 million to do it. If you have comps that are $200 million, now you can sort of in theory double your post-money valuation to get that. It's that sort of thinking that we use almost as a sniff test. Really, we use the bottoms up, but also the tops down to make sure, does this make sense?
My main comment here is that basically if you'll protect it, you'll never get that argument. It's when you can't protect it and there's holes in your system, then they'll start negotiating.
Great, so our time is up. So I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion. If there's any final thoughts, I don't want to cut anyone off. Great, thank you all.